There is a woman in Okinawa who is 103 years old. She wakes before sunrise. She tends a small garden. She eats breakfast with her moai, the group of 5 women she has known since she was a child. And she does not describe what she does as a wellness practice, or a longevity protocol, or a lifestyle she curated. She describes it as her life. And when researchers from the National Institute on Aging first arrived in Okinawa in the 1970s, trying to understand why this island had more people over 100 years old per capita than anywhere else on Earth, they expected to find a secret, a supplement, a genetic anomaly, something they could isolate, bottle, and explain in a single paper. What they found instead was harder to reduce to a headline. It was not one thing. It was everything, all at once, working together. Japan has the highest life expectancy of any major nation on Earth. Women in Japan live on average to 88, men to nearly 82. That gap between Japan and the United States is not a rounding error. It is not statistical noise. American men average 75, American women 79. That is a difference of somewhere between 6 and 9 years of life, depending on which data you use, and it has been consistent for decades. After watching this video, you will grasp exactly why that gap exists. Not in vague cultural terms, not in soft suggestions about green tea and fresh air, in specific, documented, measurable reasons that researchers have spent 50 years studying, and that most people in the West have never been told clearly. Before we get into it, there is something worth understanding about how Japan got here, because it was not always this way. In the early 1960s, Japan had one of the shortest life expectancies in the developed world. Tuberculosis was common. Cerebrovascular disease was rampant. The post-war diet was inadequate in ways that showed up in the mortality data. And then something shifted, not overnight and not because of a single policy, but because of a combination of changes in healthcare, in food, in infrastructure, in culture, that compounded over decades into one of the most remarkable public health transformations in modern history. That matters, because it means none of this is genetic destiny. It means it was built, which means it can be understood. And if it can be understood, it can be applied. The first reason is diet, but I want you to stay with me because what most people understand about the Japanese diet and what actually drives the longevity data are 2 different things. The typical summary goes something like this. Japanese people eat fish and rice and vegetables and not very much red meat, and that is why they live longer. That summary is not wrong, but it misses the mechanism. Japan's low rates of ischemic heart disease and several major cancers are not simply explained by the presence of fish and the absence of cheeseburgers. They are explained by what those dietary patterns do, specifically, to 3 biological systems: inflammation, blood pressure, and body composition. Saturated fatty acids from red meat, consumed in the quantities typical in Western diets, drive systemic inflammation and raise LDL cholesterol in ways that directly increase cardiovascular mortality. Japan's red meat consumption has historically been a fraction of American levels. Meanwhile, the omega-3 fatty acids in fish, the kind Japan consumes in quantities most Americans never approach, do the opposite. They reduce inflammatory markers, they support arterial health, they protect against the same cardiovascular events that kill Americans at rates Japan has managed to keep genuinely low. This is not philosophy. This is measured in the blood of people who eat these diets for a lifetime. And then there is the question of what Japanese people do not eat. Simply as a function of what their food culture was built around, Japan's obesity rate sits at approximately 4%. The United States is somewhere around 42%. And obesity is not just a cosmetic category. It is a direct risk factor for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, several cancers, and a range of inflammatory conditions that collectively shorten lives in ways that show up clearly in life expectancy comparisons. You cannot look at that gap between 4% and 42% and believe the difference in life expectancy is coincidental. The second reason is a principle called Hara Hachi Bu, 3 Japanese words that translate roughly as eat until you are 80% full. What you may not have heard is the specific physiological reason it works. Your brain registers satiety with a delay of 10 to 20 minutes behind your stomach. By the time you feel full in the way most people understand fullness, you have already eaten past the point of actual biological need. Hara Hachi Bu is not a calorie restriction diet. It is not tracked. It is not calculated. It is a culturally embedded habit, practiced especially in Okinawa, that naturally produces a mild caloric deficit without deprivation. The average Okinawan man in traditional studies consumed roughly 1,800 calories a day. The average American man consumes closer to 2,500. That 300 to 700 calorie daily difference, maintained over decades, does something to the body that researchers who study caloric restriction have been trying to understand for years. It reduces oxidative stress. It slows certain aging processes at the cellular level. It keeps body weight in a range that protects against nearly every major disease category that kills people early. The third reason is green tea. And I say that not as a soft wellness suggestion, but because the research on matcha and sencha specifically is more substantial than most people realize. Japan's tea culture is not decorative. It is daily, consistent, and lifelong. Green tea contains catechins, a class of antioxidants that have demonstrated anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and anti-carcinogenic properties in multiple study contexts. It also contains L-theanine, which interacts with caffeine in a way that produces calm, sustained focus without the cortisol spike associated with coffee. Japan's culture of regular green tea consumption, several cups a day, every day for most of a lifetime, is not a fringe factor in the longevity picture. It is part of a dietary pattern that compounds with every other factor on this list. The fourth reason is the concept of shun, the principle of seasonality. In Japanese cooking, shun means eating what is fresh, what belongs to this moment, what has just been harvested. It is a centuries-old relationship with food that produces something nutritionally significant, a diet that rotates through seasonal produce rather than relying on the same shelf-stable, processed, or out-of-season items year-round. Japan's access to and cultural insistence on fresh food means that the average person consumes a far higher range of phytochemicals, vitamins, and micronutrients than diets built primarily on processed and packaged foods. Dietary diversity, the number of different foods consumed regularly, turns out to matter enormously for gut microbiome health, immune function, and long-term disease prevention. Okinawans, specifically, have been documented consuming more than 200 different foods and spices as part of their regular diet, over the course of a year, but consistently, seasonally, rotatingly. The fifth reason is something that does not make it into most articles about Japanese longevity because it is harder to photograph for a wellness piece. It is the healthcare system. Japan adopted universal health coverage decades ago. Every citizen, every resident, regardless of income, has access to the same preventive care. And Japan's system is explicitly structured around prevention rather than treatment. Regular health screenings, subsidized early interventions, and a cultural norm of seeing a doctor before you are sick rather than only after you are already in crisis. It sounds simple. In practice, it means that cardiovascular risks are caught and addressed before they become cardiovascular events. It means cancers are detected at earlier stages. It means the gap between symptom and treatment is measured in weeks rather than the months or years that delayed care or financial inability to access care creates in other systems. Japan's healthcare expenditure as a share of GDP is, remarkably, below most other OECD nations. Better outcomes, lower cost. The efficiency comes from not waiting until people are catastrophically ill before intervening. The sixth reason is Ikigai. Ikigai is a Japanese concept that translates loosely as reason to live. It describes the point at which what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what sustains you financially all intersect. It is a philosophical orientation toward daily life that appears to have measurable biological consequences. Studies on purpose and longevity have found that people who report a strong sense of purpose have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, better sleep quality, and longer lives on average than those who do not. Japan does not have a concept of retirement as withdrawal. older adults are expected to remain contributing members of their communities, families, and work lives for as long as they choose. That ongoing sense of relevance and purpose appears to buffer against the health decline that, in other cultures, follows the abrupt end of a working identity. The seventh reason is the moai, the Okinawan practice of maintaining a lifelong circle of friends, a fixed social group formed in childhood that supports its members financially, emotionally, and practically across an entire lifespan. Moai are structured, committed, long-term social contracts. They were originally financial mutual aid systems, each member contributing to a communal fund that could be drawn on in times of need. Over time, they became something broader. The secure knowledge that you will not face illness, financial hardship, or grief alone is not just emotionally comforting, it is biologically protective. The Adachi cohort study in Tokyo found that men in neighborhoods with stronger social connectedness had significantly lower risk of all-cause mortality. Loneliness, by contrast, has been associated with cortisol dysregulation, immune suppression, and a mortality risk increase roughly equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Japan built the antidote to loneliness into its social architecture, and it shows in the data. The eighth reason is physical movement. Not the Western version of physical movement, which tends to mean structured, scheduled, intense exercise separated from daily life and therefore, for most people, intermittent at best. Japanese physical activity is integrated. Walking is the default mode of transportation in Japanese cities. The design of the urban environment makes it nearly impossible to live a sedentary life. Trains are not door-to-door services. You walk to the station, you stand on the platform, you walk from the other station to wherever you are going. Over the course of an average day, a person living in Tokyo walks considerably more than a person living in a car-dependent American suburb, not because they are trying to exercise, but because the infrastructure requires it. In Okinawa specifically, older adults get up and down from floor-level seating dozens of times a day, a movement pattern that builds lower body strength and balance in ways that directly reduce fall risk, which is itself a significant cause of mortality in older adults. The ninth reason is something called intentional empty space. Not physical minimalism for its own sake, though that is part of it, but a cultural relationship with space, time, and stimulation that is fundamentally different from the Western default toward constant activity and constant accumulation. The Japanese concept of applies to sound, to schedule, to the physical environment, and to attention. It is the recognition that what is absent is as important as what is present, that pauses matter, that rest is not laziness, that a kitchen counter with nothing on it is not an unfinished project but a completed one. The chronic stress load that comes with overcrowded physical environments, overscheduled days, and constant sensory stimulation is well documented in the cortisol research. Japan's cultural norm of intentional restraint, of spaces and schedules that include emptiness by design, appears to buffer its population against the kind of low-level chronic stress that, over decades, degrades cardiovascular health, immune function, and overall longevity. The 10th reason is fermented food. Miso, natto, pickled vegetables, soy sauce in its traditionally fermented form. These are staples of the Japanese diet in a way that has no real equivalent in standard Western eating. Fermented foods provide probiotic bacteria that support the gut microbiome, and the gut microbiome, research increasingly shows, is connected to immune function, inflammatory response, mental health, and metabolic health in ways that researchers are still mapping. Japan's regular, daily consumption of fermented foods across a lifetime appears to maintain gut microbiome diversity in ways that may contribute to the overall disease resistance that characterizes its population. The 11th reason is the relationship with salt. And this one is more complicated than it first appears, because Japan's history with salt and longevity is actually a story of correction rather than perfection. Historically, high salt intake in Japan was associated with elevated rates of cerebrovascular disease and stroke. The deliberate, documented, policy-driven reduction of salt consumption in Japan over the second half of the 20th century, replacing salty preserved foods with fresher alternatives, reducing sodium in processed and prepared foods, directly corresponded with a sharp decline in stroke mortality. That decline is one of the primary drivers of the rise in Japanese life expectancy over the past 50 years. The lesson is not that Japanese food is low in sodium today. Some of it is quite high. The lesson is that Japan identified the problem, acted on it systematically, and the mortality data changed. The 12th reason involves something researchers call social integration for the elderly. In Japan, aging is not treated as a withdrawal from society. The national holiday, Respect for the Aged Day, established in 1963, is not a symbolic gesture. It reflects a genuine cultural orientation toward older adults as valuable, active members of community life rather than as a burden or a dependent class. Older adults in Japan are more likely to live near or with family than their Western counterparts. They are more likely to remain employed, to contribute meaningfully to community organizations, to maintain social roles that give them status and purpose. The biological consequences of feeling valued versus feeling discarded are measurable. Immune function, cognitive decline rates, and cardiovascular health all respond to the psychosocial environment in ways that make cultural attitudes toward aging a legitimate longevity factor, not a soft one. The 13th reason is sleep. Japan has a complicated relationship with sleep, and not an entirely positive one. Urban Japanese work culture, particularly in large cities, has historically produced significant sleep deprivation, which is a genuine public health concern. But traditional Japanese sleeping practices, particularly the custom of inamuri, the culturally accepted practice of brief restorative sleep during the day, provide a partial buffer against the effects of shortened nighttime sleep. And the design of Japanese homes, quieter, lower to the ground, cooler, with less artificial light penetrating the sleeping environment, supports sleep quality in ways that the typical American bedroom setup often does not. Sleep quality is a direct predictor of inflammatory markers, metabolic health, immune function, and cognitive aging. It is threaded through every system that longevity depends on. The 14th reason is seaweed. Japanese seaweed consumption, particularly in Okinawa, provides dietary iodine, fucoidins, and a range of micronutrients that are largely absent from Western diets. Research on mozuku, the seaweed specific to Okinawa, suggests that its fucoidin content may have properties that support gut microbiome health, reduce inflammation, and potentially offer some protection against certain cancers. The principle it represents is significant. Japan's dietary diversity extends into food categories that most Western diets never reach, providing nutritional coverage that a diet built primarily around land animals, grains, and processed foods simply cannot match. The 15th reason is the question of what Japan does not do, and I want to spend a moment here because it is as important as any item on this list. Japan does not have the processed food consumption profile of the United States. It does not have the portion sizes. It does not have the same relationship with sugar, with refined carbohydrates, with the industrial food products that make up an increasing share of the American diet. This is not about individual discipline. This is about what a food environment makes easy and what it makes difficult. In Japan, the infrastructure of daily eating, convenience stores, school lunches, the options available at a train station, is built around a different set of defaults. Fresh food, small portions, variety. When the environment makes healthy eating the path of least resistance, people follow it not because they are more virtuous, but because the choice architecture points them there. And here is something you may not have been told directly. The factors driving Japanese longevity are not equally applicable to someone living outside Japan. You cannot move to a car-dependent suburb and walk like a Tokyo resident. You cannot replicate a moai in a culture that does not have that social infrastructure. You may not be able to access universal preventive health care depending on where you live. That is real. But several of these factors are entirely available to you right now, wherever you are. Hara Hachi Bu requires no infrastructure, only attention. A diet that shifts toward fish, fermented foods, seasonal vegetables, and away from red meat and processed food does not require living in Okinawa. The research on purpose and social connection applies regardless of nationality. What Japan reveals is not a prescription that requires becoming Japanese. It is a map of the variables that matter most and which direction each one should move in. The honest complication in all of this is that the Okinawan story, specifically, has been scrutinized in recent years. A researcher named Saul Newman published analysis questioning whether some centenarian data from Okinawa was reliable, pointing to record-keeping gaps caused by the destruction of family registers during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. And more recent demographic data shows that younger generations in Okinawa have shifted toward fast food consumption and have the highest BMI of any prefecture in Japan, which complicates the tidy narrative of the island as an unchanging longevity paradise. These are legitimate criticisms. They do not erase 50 years of research showing that Japan as a whole outlives the vast majority of other nations. But they do serve as a reminder that longevity is not inherited or permanent. It is maintained. What makes Japan's achievement worth studying is precisely that. It was not handed to them by geography or genetics. It was built, across generations, through specific choices about what to eat, how to move, how to structure communities, how to treat older adults, and how to design a healthcare system around prevention rather than crisis. Those choices are legible. They are documentable. And while no single person in another country will replicate the full ecosystem that produced Japanese longevity, the variables themselves are not mysterious. They are specific. They have mechanisms. And the distance between understanding them and beginning to apply them, at least some of them, in your own life, is shorter than most people assume.